She walked the cobblestone streets in the grip of fever, her skin burning with infection, her breathing shallow and labored. The plague doctor approached her doorway, his beaked mask cutting through the mist like some ancient bird of prey. She reached out for help, he reached back, but not to heal. This is a true story, too. And what happened next in the plague-stricken streets of Toulouse would blur the line between medicine and monstrosity forever. Toulouse in the early 17th century was the jewel of Languedoc, a city of red brick and terracotta roofs spreading along the banks of the Garonne River. It was home to one of France's oldest universities, a centre of law and learning, a place where the wealthy built their hotels particuliers, with interior courtyards, and where merchants traded wine, wheat and wool from across the region. The Capitole, the Grand City Hall, stood as a symbol of civic pride. The Parlement of Toulouse, the regional Supreme Court, wielded enormous power over justice throughout the south. This was a city that prided itself on order, on civilization, on the rule of law. But in 1628, all of that began to crumble. The disease arrived quietly at first. A merchant returning from Marseille, a traveler from Spain. The exact source would never be confirmed. What mattered was that within weeks, the bubonic plague had established itself in the poorest quarters of the city. And once it took hold, it spread like fire through dry timber. Tonight, we're opening a file that has remained sealed in the shadows of French medical history for nearly 4 centuries. A file that speaks to the darkest possibilities of human ambition when society collapses and death becomes so common that life loses its value. This is the story of Jean Mouton, a master surgeon who turned the greatest catastrophe of 17th century Toulouse into his own grotesque laboratory. A man who didn't just witness the plague, he exploited it. The events I'm about to describe are not fiction. They're not legend embellished over centuries. They're documented in the archives of the Parlement of Toulouse, one of the most powerful courts in France, second only to Paris itself. The accusations were real, the investigation was real, and the exile that followed was real. What Jean Mouton did in those plague houses, in those final moments between life and death, represents one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of medicine. And if stories like this keep you awake at night, if you find yourself drawn to the mysteries that history tried to bury, then subscribe to this channel. Because the files I open here are the ones that refuse to stay closed. You need to understand what the plague meant in this era. This wasn't simply an illness. It was an apocalypse that arrived on foot, that knocked on your door, that turned your neighbor into a vector of death. The symptoms were unmistakable and horrifying. It began with fever and chills, with aching limbs and crushing fatigue. Then came the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that gave the disease its name. They appeared in the groin, the armpits, under the jaw, swelling to the size of eggs or even larger, black and purple and excruciatingly painful. The victim would vomit. They would develop dark patches on their skin, as blood vessels ruptured beneath the surface. They would fall into delirium, crying out for water, for mercy, for death. Most terrifying of all was the speed. You could wake up healthy and be dead by sunset. The mortality rate in urban outbreaks reached 60 to 80%. There was no cure. There was barely even treatment. The physicians of the era understood nothing about bacteria or transmission. They believed the disease spread through miasma, through bad air, through an imbalance of the bodily humors. They prescribed bloodletting, which only weakened the patient further. They recommended fleeing the infected areas, which only spread the disease to new regions. They were, in essence, helpless, and so Toulouse began to die. By 1629, the outbreak had become catastrophic. The official death toll would eventually reach estimates of 30,000 souls, though the true number may never be known. Record-keeping collapsed, along with everything else. The streets emptied as the healthy barricaded themselves indoors. Markets closed. Churches locked their doors after priests died in waves from administering last rites. The wealthy, the capitouls and magistrates and university professors fled to their country estates, abandoning the city to its fate. What remained was a nightmare landscape. Houses marked with red crosses to indicate infection. Bodies left in doorways because no one would collect them. Mass graves dug at the city's edge, filled so quickly they had to be expanded again and again. The stench of death hung over everything, mixing with the smoke from fires of sulfur and aromatic herbs that people burned in a futile attempt to purify the air. At night, the city fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the creaking wheels of the death carts and the occasional scream from a plague house. This was the world Jean Mouton entered, or perhaps this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Who was Jean Mouton? That's the first question we need to answer, and it's not a simple one. The historical record on him is frustratingly sparse, which is itself revealing. In an era when master surgeons of notable skill often left extensive documentation, Mouton appears in the archives primarily through his crimes. What we can piece together suggests a man of education and ambition, someone who had achieved the title of master surgeon, which meant he had completed an apprenticeship and been accepted into one of the surgical guilds. This was no common barber surgeon who pulled teeth and lanced boils. This was a man trained in the art of the knife. But here's where his story becomes interesting. In 17th century France, there was a fierce hierarchy within medicine. At the top were the physicians, university-educated men who studied Latin texts and ancient Greek medical theory, but considered it beneath their dignity to actually touch patients. They prescribed treatments from a distance, issued diagnoses based on urine samples and astrological charts, and jealously guarded their professional status. Below them were the surgeons, craftsmen who worked with their hands, who cut and sutured and amputated. They were not considered intellectuals. They were not invited to the same social circles. They were, in the eyes of the physicians, little better than butchers. And Jean Mouton, it seems, resented this. The evidence suggests he was a man hungry for knowledge, for advancement, for respect. He wanted to understand anatomy, not through ancient texts but through direct observation. He wanted to learn the secrets of the human body by opening it up and looking inside. But there was a problem, a massive, suffocating, church-enforced problem. In 1628, France, human dissection was strictly regulated. The church considered the body sacred, a temple of the soul, and objected to its desecration even in death. The law allowed dissections only under very specific circumstances. Primarily, anatomists could only legally work on the bodies of executed criminals, and those bodies were rare. A city might have 1 or 2 public executions per year. The demand for anatomical specimens, driven by the growing professionalization of surgery and the establishment of medical schools, far outstripped the legal supply. This created a black market. In Paris and other major cities, grave robbers called resurrection men would dig up fresh corpses and sell them to anatomists. But these operations were dangerous, illegal, and expensive. For a surgeon in Toulouse, ambitious and frustrated and desperate to advance his skills, the outbreak of plague in 1628 must have seemed like a dark gift from God himself, because suddenly there were bodies everywhere, and no one was counting them. The city's response to the plague followed established protocols that had been developed through bitter experience in previous outbreaks. They created isolation houses where the infected were quarantined away from healthy family members. They hired body carriers, men known grimly as corbeaux, crows, to collect the dead from the streets and houses and transport them to mass graves. And critically, they hired plague doctors. The plague doctor. The image has become iconic, almost theatrical. The long black coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and most recognizable of all, the beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, thought to filter the poisoned air. These men were given extraordinary authority during outbreaks. They could enter any house, examine any patient, declare anyone infected. They were immune from most laws, given special passes to move freely during curfews. And they were paid enormous sums, danger money, because the position was considered a death sentence. Many plague doctors were second-rate medical men, barber surgeons who couldn't establish successful practices, foreigners willing to take risks for quick wealth, or desperate men with gambling debts who needed money fast. Jean Mouton volunteered for this position in Toulouse. The records show he served as a médecin de peste, a plague doctor, during the height of the outbreak. On the surface, this might seem noble, a master surgeon offering his skills during a time of crisis. But understanding what we know about what came next, we have to ask a different question. Did Jean Mouton volunteer to help the dying, or did he volunteer for access? Because a plague doctor in 1628 had something that would have been invaluable to an ambitious anatomist. He had unlimited access to fresh bodies. He could enter quarantine houses alone. He could examine the sick in private. He could make determinations about who had died and who was still alive. And in the chaos of mass death, with hasty burials and overwhelmed officials, who would notice if a body went missing? Who would check? Who would care? If you're finding this case as compelling as I am, if you want to see more stories that examine the intersection of medicine and morality, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these forgotten files, and trust me, we're just getting started. The accusations against Jean Mouton began to surface in 1631 as the plague finally began to release its grip on Toulouse. The worst had passed. The death rate slowed. People began to emerge from their homes, to count their losses, to try to rebuild what had been destroyed. And as society began to restore itself, as order began to return, questions started to be asked. The first complaints came from families in the Saint-Cyprien quarter, one of the poorest neighborhoods on the left bank of the Garonne. Multiple households reported the same disturbing story. A family member had fallen ill with plague. The plague doctor, Jean Mouton, had come to examine them. He had declared them gravely ill near death and ordered them quarantined. The family had been forced to evacuate the house or remain locked inside. And then, within a day or two, Mouton had returned to announce that their loved one had passed away. The body, he explained, had already been collected for burial in the mass graves, as was procedure during plague time to prevent further contagion. But here's what made these families suspicious. They had seen their loved ones just hours before Mouton's announcement, and while yes, they were sick, they hadn't seemed at death's door. A woman named Marguerite Belmont reported that her husband had been ill, but conscious, speaking to her that morning. That afternoon, Mouton arrived and sent her out of the house to fetch water from the public fountain. When she returned an hour later, Mouton informed her that her husband had suddenly deteriorated and passed away. The body was already gone. She would never see it again. Another family described an elderly mother who had contracted the plague, but seemed to be surviving. She was weak, yes, but she was drinking water. She recognized her children. Mouton examined her and ordered the family out of the room for their own safety. They waited outside the door. They heard movement inside, the sound of furniture being shifted, low voices, though Mouton was supposedly alone with their unconscious mother. Then silence. Then Mouton emerged and told them she had died. The body would be collected shortly. It too vanished before the family could demand to see it. These stories reached the ears of a magistrate named François Delcourt, one of the few officials who had remained in Toulouse throughout the plague. Delcourt was a careful man, a skeptic, someone who believed in evidence over emotion. But he also knew Toulouse. He knew its people. And he knew that in the chaos of plague, with mass graves and hasty burials, it would be almost impossible to track individual bodies, which meant it would be the perfect cover for someone with darker intentions. Delcourt began a quiet investigation. He started asking questions of the corbeaux, the body carriers. Had they collected bodies from every house where Jean Mouton declared someone dead? The answers were inconsistent. Some said yes, others couldn't remember. The truth was that the crows themselves were often drunk, desperate men who didn't keep careful records. Bodies were supposed to be wrapped in shrouds, loaded onto carts, and taken directly to the plague pits. But in practice, the system was chaotic. Bodies sometimes sat in houses for days before collection. Sometimes they were taken to temporary holding areas. Sometimes they disappeared. Delcourt also spoke with other medical men, physicians and surgeons who had remained in the city. And here he uncovered something interesting. Several of them mentioned, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that Jean Mouton had been conducting private anatomical studies during the plague. He had, according to their accounts, been dissecting bodies to better understand the disease. Some thought this was commendable, a man of science seeking knowledge. Others found it suspicious. Where exactly was Mouton getting these bodies? The official channels for anatomical specimens hadn't changed. Executed criminals were still the only legal source, and there hadn't been any executions during the plague months. So where were Mouton's specimens coming from? The investigation expanded. Delcourt obtained permission from the Parlement of Toulouse, which had resumed its sessions after the worst of the plague had passed, to search Mouton's residence and workshop. What they found there would form the core of the case against him. In a cellar beneath Mouton's workshop, investigators discovered what can only be described as a private anatomy laboratory. There were tables stained with old fluids, surgical instruments laid out with care, and most damning of all, jars preserved in alcohol containing organs and tissue samples, human organs, human tissue, the heart of a young man, the liver of a woman, sections of intestine, portions of lung tissue, all carefully labeled with dates. Many of those dates corresponded to the peak months of the plague. But it was what else they found that transformed the case from disturbing to nightmarish. Among Mouton's papers were detailed anatomical drawings and notes. These weren't crude sketches. They were precise, careful studies of internal structures, the branching of blood vessels, the attachment points of muscles, the layers of the abdominal wall, the kind of knowledge you could only gain from repeated systematic dissection. And written in Mouton's own hand were observations about fresh specimens and notes about subjects obtained through civic duty during the pestilence. Mouton was arrested. The charges brought against him by the Parlement included corpse desecration, illegal dissection, and profiteering. The claim being that he had sold some anatomical specimens to medical students or collectors. But there was a fourth charge, whispered about more than formally documented, that made the case truly horrifying. Vivisection, the cutting of living flesh, the dissection of subjects who were not yet dead. Let me be very clear about something. The evidence for this particular accusation is not as concrete as the evidence for the other charges. There are no witnesses who claim to see Mouton cutting into a living person. There are no confessions. What there is, however, is medical opinion from other surgeons who examined some of Mouton's preserved specimens and his detailed notes, and what they concluded was deeply disturbing. Several of the organs showed characteristics that suggested they had been removed very shortly after death. So shortly, in fact, that they retained what one surgeon described as the bloom of life. Blood vessels that were still fully engorged, tissue that showed no signs of the immediate decay that sets in after death. In a few cases, the examining surgeons noted evidence of what they called vital reaction, meaning biological responses that could only occur in living tissue. How was this possible? Here's where the case becomes both more understandable and more horrible. One of the characteristics of bubonic plague in its final stages was a condition that contemporary doctors called the plague coma, or apparent death. Victims would fall into a deep unconscious state, their breathing becoming so shallow it was almost undetectable, their heartbeat so faint it couldn't be felt by the crude methods available at the time. They would lie completely still, unresponsive to any stimulus. Their skin would grow cold. To anyone without modern medical equipment, they appeared dead. But they weren't, not yet. They were in a state of profound biological shutdown, the body's last desperate attempt to survive the massive systemic infection. Some patients in this state would eventually die, but some, a small percentage, would emerge from it hours or even days later. There are documented cases throughout plague history of people waking up in mass graves, of bodies moving in burial shrouds, of scratches on the inside of coffin lids. The accusation against Jean Mouton was this, that he had deliberately exploited this ambiguity, that when he examined plague victims and found them in this comatose state, rather than waiting to confirm death, he had declared them dead prematurely. And then, working quickly before actual death occurred, and before anyone else saw the body, he had begun his dissections. He had cut into flesh that was still technically alive, had removed organs that were still functioning, had pursued his anatomical studies on subjects who might have survived if given more time. The evidence for this came partly from the specimens themselves, but it also came from something else found in Mouton's papers, a journal entry written in Latin that has been translated and debated by historians ever since. The entry reads in part, "The moment between life and death provides unique observational opportunities. The structures retain their color and form. The fluids move naturally, revealing paths that become obscure once the vital force has departed. In the service of understanding, certain boundaries must be crossed. Was this the confession of a man conducting vivisection? Or was it simply a surgeon noting that dissection performed shortly after death yielded better specimens than dissection performed days later? The language is ambiguous, but combined with the other evidence, the family's testimonies, the suspiciously fresh specimens, the pattern of bodies disappearing after Mouton's visits, the Parlement investigators concluded that Jean Mouton had crossed a line that even the desperate circumstances of the plague could not excuse. And now I want to share something with you, something that keeps me coming back to cases like this, turning them over in my mind late at night when I should be sleeping, because the question here isn't just what Jean Mouton did, it's why. What drives a man to look at suffering and see opportunity? What allows someone to justify, even to themselves, the idea of cutting into another human being who might still be alive? If you're still with me, if this story has grabbed hold of you the way it grabbed hold of me, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Was Jean Mouton a monster? Or was he a man of his time, someone who saw a chance to advance medical knowledge and took it? Moral boundaries be damned. I read every comment. I want to know what you think. Because cases like this, they don't have easy answers. The trial of Jean Mouton before the Parlement of Toulouse in 1631 was a complicated affair. The Parlement was composed of magistrates, lawyers and clergymen, men who were educated and sophisticated, but also deeply embedded in the religious and social hierarchies of their time. They faced a difficult situation. On one hand, the evidence against Mouton was substantial, multiple testimonies, physical evidence from his laboratory, his own suspicious writings. On the other hand, Mouton was a master surgeon, a man of some standing, someone who could claim he had volunteered for dangerous plague duty when others fled. He could argue he was serving the advancement of medical science. He had, in a sense, the protection of professional status. The proceedings were not fully public, which was common for cases involving medical matters, or where the details were considered too disturbing for general audiences. What we know from the surviving court documents is that Mouton initially denied the most serious charges. He admitted to conducting anatomical studies. He claimed all his specimens had been obtained legally from bodies of plague victims who were genuinely dead. He argued that the families who testified against him were grieving and confused, that in the chaos of the plague, memories were unreliable, that he had followed all proper procedures. But as the trial continued, the prosecution presented evidence that undermined Mouton's defense. They brought forward testimony from a former assistant, a young apprentice surgeon named Thomas Vidal, who had worked with Mouton during the early months of the plague. Vidal's testimony was damning. He described how Mouton would arrive at plague houses and examine patients who were in the comatose state. He described how Mouton would send family members away on errands or order them out of the house entirely. And he described, in halting, uncomfortable language, moments when he was certain the person on the table was not dead. The faint movement of an eyelid, a barely audible exhalation, the warmth of skin that should have been cold. Vidal claimed that when he expressed concern, when he suggested they wait longer to confirm death, Mouton had dismissed him. The apprentice quoted his master as saying, "In plague time, we cannot afford the luxury of certainty. The study must proceed while the material is fresh. This is the price of progress." The price of progress. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment, because it gets to the heart of the moral question here. Throughout medical history, there have been moments when the advancement of knowledge came at a terrible cost. Anatomists in the 18th and 19th centuries would rob graves or even commission individuals to end the lives of others to supply bodies. Researchers in the 20th century conducted experiments on prisoners, on the mentally ill, on populations they considered expendable. And in every case, the justification was the same. We're learning. We're advancing medicine. We're helping future generations. The suffering of a few is justified by the benefit to many, but who gets to make that decision? Who decides which lives are expendable in the service of progress? Jean Mouton, it seems, had decided that plague victims, people who were dying anyway, people from the poorest quarters who had no one to speak for them, were acceptable subjects for his studies. He had made himself judge, executioner and dissector. the Parlement of Toulouse reached its verdict in the autumn of 1631. Jean Mouton was found guilty of corpse desecration, illegal dissection and profiteering. The vivisection charge, the most serious allegation, was noted in the court documents, but not definitively proven to the standard required for a capital sentence. This distinction mattered, because the punishment for vivisection, the dissection of living subjects, would have been execution, likely by burning or breaking on the wheel, methods reserved for the most heinous crimes. But without absolute proof, without a confession or eyewitness testimony that could not be disputed, the Parlement chose a different sentence: exile, bannissement. Jean Mouton was stripped of his title as master surgeon, banned from practicing medicine anywhere in the region of Languedoc, and ordered to leave Toulouse permanently. His property was confiscated, his laboratory destroyed, his preserved specimens burned. He was given 1 week to depart the city. If he was ever found within the boundaries of Languedoc again, the sentence would be upgraded to execution without trial. And then Jean Mouton disappeared from history. There are no records of where he went, whether he traveled to another region under a false name, whether he continued to practice surgery elsewhere, or whether he died shortly after his exile. He simply vanishes from the archives, a ghost who left behind only the records of his trial and the horrified memories of those who survived his attentions. But his story didn't end with his exile, because the case raised questions that the Parlement and the medical community of Toulouse could not easily answer. In the years following the plague, as the city slowly recovered and rebuilt, there was a debate among physicians and surgeons about the ethics of anatomical study. Some argued that Mouton had been unfairly persecuted, that his methods, while unorthodox, had been justified by the extraordinary circumstances. Others insisted that certain boundaries were absolute, that human dignity extended even to the dying, that medicine without moral limits became something monstrous. The case also prompted changes in how plague outbreaks were managed. Regulations were put in place requiring multiple confirmations of death before bodies could be removed from houses. Plague doctors were no longer allowed to work alone. Families were given more rights to demand the return of bodies for proper burial. Whether these changes would have prevented someone like Mouton from exploiting the system is unclear, but the attempt was made. And there's one more element to this story that I find particularly fascinating, and perhaps the most relevant to our time. The Jean Mouton case exists in historical shadow, partly because it occurred at the same time as another notorious crime in Toulouse, one that has become far more famous. During this same plague outbreak, there was a gang of thieves who robbed plague victims and corpses, stealing valuables from the dead and dying. These criminals became known as the Four Thieves of Toulouse, and legend claims they invented a special vinegar made with herbs and spices that protected them from infection. That vinegar recipe still exists today. You can buy variations of Four Thieves vinegar as a health tonic. The Four Thieves became legends. Their story has been told and retold, romanticized into folklore. But Jean Mouton, whose crimes were arguably more disturbing, more psychologically complex, has been largely forgotten. Why? Perhaps because theft is a crime we understand, even if we condemn it. Perhaps because the Four Thieves didn't pretend to be helping anyone. They were criminals, clear and simple. But Mouton was different. He was educated. He was a healer, or supposed to be. He committed his violations under the guise of science, of progress, of medical advancement. And that's more uncomfortable to process, isn't it? Because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather not ask, about how easily good intentions can become justifications for terrible acts, about how the pursuit of knowledge can corrupt as surely as the pursuit of wealth or power. I want you to think about something. Right now, as you listen to this, medical science is built on a foundation that includes deeply unethical acts. The anatomy textbooks that doctors still study today are based on knowledge gained from dissections that were often illegal, sometimes non-consensual, sometimes performed on people who had no choice and no voice. The surgical techniques that save lives were developed through trial and error on patients who didn't fully understand what was being done to them. We benefit from this knowledge every day. Every time you go to a hospital, every time a surgeon operates successfully, you're receiving the fruits of a tree with some very dark roots. That doesn't mean we should reject modern medicine. But it does mean we should remember, we should know the cost. We should understand that progress is not always clean, not always noble, and that the people celebrated as pioneers sometimes achieved their breakthroughs by stepping over lines that should never be crossed. Jean Mouton believed he was advancing medical knowledge. Perhaps he was. Perhaps somewhere in his preserved specimens, in his careful notes and drawings, there were insights that helped surgeons understand human anatomy better. Perhaps his work, however achieved, contributed to saving lives later. But here's what I believe. Some costs are too high. Some prices shouldn't be paid. And the moment we start deciding that certain lives matter less, that certain people are acceptable subjects for our experiments and ambitions, that's the moment we lose something essential about our humanity. If this file has stayed with you, if it's made you think, made you question, made you uncomfortable in all the right ways, then share it. Send it to someone who appreciates stories that dig beneath the surface. Because cases like this need to be remembered, not as entertainment, not as simple morality tales with clear villains and heroes, but as complicated, difficult examinations of what human beings are capable of when circumstances align and boundaries blur. The story of Jean Mouton is not about a monster. Monsters are easy to understand. They're different from us. They're other. But Jean Mouton was a man, an educated, ambitious, probably quite ordinary man who found himself in extraordinary circumstances and made choices that revealed something dark within him, or maybe something dark within all of us. The capacity to rationalize, to justify, to look at suffering and see not a human being but an opportunity. Toulouse today is a beautiful city. The university still stands. The Garonne still flows past the red brick buildings. The mass graves from the plague have long since been built over, forgotten, lost to time. But beneath the modern streets, beneath the cafes and shops and monuments, that history remains. The 30,000 who died. The families destroyed. And somewhere in those unmarked plague pits, the victims of Jean Mouton lie alongside everyone else, their stories lost, their final moments known only to a man who was exiled for what he did to them. The Parlement of Toulouse wanted Jean Mouton gone, wanted his story buried, wanted to move past the horror of the plague years, and to a large extent, they succeeded. His name is barely known today. Most people who study the Toulouse plague have heard of the 4 thieves, but never of the surgeon who turned dying patients into specimens. History has a way of forgetting the stories that make us too uncomfortable. But I remember. This channel exists to remember, to open the files that were supposed to stay closed, to look at the cases that polite society would rather not discuss. Because I believe that in these dark corners of history, we find the most important truths about human nature. Not the sanitized, simplified versions they teach in schools, but the complicated, morally ambiguous reality of what people actually do when no one is watching, when circumstances permit, when they think they can get away with it. So tonight, as you turn off this video and go about your evening, I want you to remember Jean Mouton. Remember the plague doctor walking through the mist-filled streets of 17th century Toulouse. Remember the families who sent their loved ones to mass graves without ever seeing them again. Remember the apprentice surgeon who testified about movements he saw, exhalations he heard, the warmth of skin that should have been cold. Remember the price of progress. And remember that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who think they're doing good. Every town keeps a secret. Toulouse kept Jean Mouton. The world forgot him. But his victims didn't. They carried the truth down into the dark earth with them. And now you know it too. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. The case is closed, but the questions remain open. And if you're brave enough to face them, I'll be here next time with another file from the shadows of history. Until then, sleep well, if you can.